All right, let's step right into the golden age of Indian cinema. We're heading to a place that was basically fueled by two things: truckloads of makeup and the bitter resentment of poets who wish they were doing something else. Yeah, you heard that right. This is the truly bizarre story of Poets and Pancakes. So, our story starts at a place called Gemini Studios. Think of it as one of the most influential film studios in India back in its heyday. Founded by the legendary S.S. Vasan, it was this whole world unto itself. And the first thing that kept this dream factory running was...
That's right, truckloads of makeup. And I'm not talking about a little powder here and there. We're talking mountains of the stuff. Enough to completely transform every single person who walked through those gates. But, the second ingredient, well, that was a whole lot more explosive.
Yep, frustrated poets. You see, the studio was this magnet for writers and thinkers, but a lot of them were totally convinced their literary genius was just being wasted on silly movie scripts. So you end up with this really bizarre mix, right? A factory churning out popular entertainment, but underneath it all, it's just simmering with this artistic resentment. A very, very strange combination.
So how in the world does a place built on, glamour and grease paint also become this hotbed for literary ambition and, well, intellectual jealousy? That's the story we're getting into. We're going to see how these two worlds slammed into each other in the strangest way imaginable.
Okay, so let's get to the title, Pancakes. What on earth do pancakes have to do with any of this?
And there it is. Pancake was just the brand name of the makeup they used, and they used a lot of it. It got slapped on pretty much everyone, totally transforming them for the camera. You could say it was the literal face of the studio, the mask that everyone who worked there had to put on.
Now, the place where all this transformation happened, it was anything but glamorous. I want you to picture this. It looked like a hair salon, but it was set up inside an old stable. It was surrounded by these giant mirrors and dozens of huge, blazing hot lights. The author of our source material, Mitran, he actually called it a place of fiery misery. So yeah, this is where the movie magic and maybe a lot of the suffering really began.
But of course, a studio is nothing without its people. And let me tell you, the personalities at Gemini were every bit as intense as those lights in the makeup room. And this is where the story starts to get really interesting.
So at the very heart of all the drama in the studio, you had two guys who could not have been more different. First, you've got the office boy. Except he wasn't a boy at all. He was a guy in his 40s. He was a poet, a real dreamer, who was absolutely convinced his talent was just rotting away while he was stuck slapping makeup on extras. And he had one person to blame for all his troubles, a man named Kotamangalam Subbu. Subbu was the undisputed number 2 at the studio, and he was everything the office boy wasn't. Super successful, always cheerful, a total genius at solving problems, and completely 100% loyal to the founder, who everyone just called the boss. And this quote, man, it just perfectly captures how valuable Subbu was. The guy was a creative powerhouse. A producer gets stuck, Subbu would immediately come up with like 14 different ways to shoot the scene. He was an actor, a writer, a poet, just a guy who was tailor-made for the movies. And you can imagine, for the poor office boy, Subbu's easy success was this constant, bitter reminder of his own failures.
So that was the daily grind at Gemini Studios, right? A strange mix of real creativity, blistering heat, and a whole lot of jealousy. But that whole world was about to be completely turned upside down by a visitor. A visitor who would end up confusing everyone for years and years.
Then one day, out of the blue, the phone lines start buzzing. The whole studio is getting ready to welcome this super important guest, a man from England. Now, you gotta remember, in post-independence India, this was still a really big deal. And right away, the confusion starts. Was this guy a poet? Or maybe an editor? The staff are all whispering theories, but nobody really knows for sure. All they knew was two things. He was from England, and he was supposed to be important.
And then he actually started to speak. And things only got worse. His English accent was so thick, so completely alien to the Tamil-speaking staff, that his entire speech was met with, well, the author calls it utter bafflement. They just stared, in total silence, completely and utterly confused. Which brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why would you invite someone all the way from England to give a speech that absolutely no one in the audience can understand? What was the point of all this?
I mean, think about the total disconnect here. You've got this English poet on stage talking about big, abstract ideas like freedom and democracy. And who's this audience? Makeup artists and film crews, people whose entire world revolves around making popular Tamil movies. These two worlds had absolutely nothing in common. So for years, his visit just became this unexplained mystery that no one could figure out.
So years go by, our author leaves Gemini Studios, and that whole mystery about the English poet just kind of fades into the background. It's just a weird old memory. And then, a totally random encounter on a dusty street changes everything. He's just walking past a post office, and he spots this pile of brand new American books being sold for like 50 paise each, basically for pennies. They were these weird, low-budget student editions. He figures they were probably some kind of anti-communist propaganda being sold off cheap to mark the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, but one title catches his eye, and he decides to buy a copy.
The book he picked up was called The God That Failed, and what it was a collection of 6 different essays, each one written by a really well-known intellectual. And in these essays, they all explain their journey, how they first embraced communism and then why they eventually turned their back on it. I mean, it was a seriously powerful political statement. So the author starts reading through the list of the 6 contributors. He sees names like Andre Gide, Richard Wright, Arthur Koestler, and then one name just jumps off the page, Stephen Spender. And boom, just like that, the penny drops. Spender, the poet, the guy they thought was an editor, the visitor nobody could understand at Gemini Studios, it was him. The whole time, it was him.
And this is exactly how he describes that feeling of realization. He says it was like a dark, forgotten chamber of his mind was suddenly lit up. The mystery wasn't just some random weird thing that happened anymore. It had a name. And now, maybe, it finally had an explanation.
Okay, so now he has this crucial piece of the puzzle. And with this new information, the author could finally understand the real reason for that incredibly strange day back at the studio.
And here is the answer to the whole mystery. You see, the people at Gemini Studios, most of them were traditional Khadi. They worshipped Gandhi. They were deeply anti-communist. To them, communism was this godless, destructive force. So the boss, S.S. Vasson, he must have invited Stephen Spender not because he was some great English poet, but because he was a famous ex-communist who had written a powerful essay tearing down that very ideology. The speech wasn't about poetry. It was about politics. It wasn't about the words he was saying. It was about who he was.
And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. The people at Gemini Studios, they heard the words, sure, but they missed the message completely. Spender's visit was a perfect example of two groups just talking past each other because neither one understood the other's world. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often do we miss the real message? How often is the true purpose of a conversation hidden, not in the words being spoken, but just in the simple fact that it's even happening in the first place?